On a gray morning in the first week of November, 1987, every farmer in Finney County, Kansas, did exactly what every farmer in Finney County, Kansas, had always done. They planted winter wheat, hard red winter wheat, the kind that had made the county famous, the kind that had built the grain elevators and the co-ops and the churches and the schools, the kind that had buried 3 generations of men and women in the churchyard outside of Garden City and put their names on the county's history the way the wind puts dust on a windowsill. Quietly, inevitably, without anyone deciding it should be so. This was not a choice. Understand that. It was not a decision made each fall at a kitchen table, weighed against alternatives, considered and reconsidered. It was gravity. It was weather. It was the smell of the soil in October and the way the light changed over the flat western Kansas horizon, and the knowledge, bone deep and inherited, that this was what you did, because this was what had always been done, and what would always be done, because the county and the crop and the people had grown together so long that separating them was like trying to separate the river from the riverbed. You could do it, maybe, but you'd destroy both in the process. Let me tell you about Finney County because you need to understand the place before you can understand the woman. And you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she did. And you need to understand what she did before you can understand why, 35 years later, people in Garden City still talk about it. Finney County sits in the southwestern corner of Kansas, flat and wide and dry in a way that eastern people find either beautiful or terrifying, depending on their temperament. The Arkansas River runs through it, or used to run through it more reliably than it does now. The soil is good, deep, dark, productive, but the weather is not always kind. Droughts come, late frosts come. Hailstorms arrive in June with the indifference of a bill collector and leave the same way. The farmers of Finney County had learned across generations to plant what survived. And what survived was winter wheat. By 1987, the county had approximately 340,000 acres under cultivation. Of those, somewhere in the neighborhood of 280,000 were planted to winter wheat every single fall. The remaining acreage was grain sorghum, a little corn along the river bottoms, and the occasional field of sunflowers that someone tried every few years before giving up. The wheat price that fall was $2.87 a bushel. Average yield in Finney County ran about 35 to 40 bushels per acre in a decent year. A good farmer on good ground could clear $80 to $90 per acre after input costs. That was the number everyone knew. That was the ceiling. Nobody questioned whether there was a higher ceiling, because the ceiling had been there so long it looked like the sky. The Hassel family had farmed 1,100 acres in Finney County since 1921. Wendell Hassel, who was 58 years old in 1987 and had the kind of face that Kansas weather makes, deeply lined, sun-darkened, patient, had farmed those acres since he was 19 years old. His father had farmed them before him. His grandfather had broken the original sod. Wendell was a methodical man. He kept records in a green ledger book that he bought every January at the hardware store in Garden City. He noted his planting dates, his input costs, his yields, his prices received. He had 39 years of green ledger books on a shelf in his office, which was a converted corner of the machine shed with a plywood desk and a single overhead bulb. He did not consider himself a philosopher. He considered himself a farmer. He planted winter wheat in November because that was what Finney County farmers did, and he was a Finney County farmer, and that was the end of the discussion. His wife, Marlene, was a quieter kind of practical. She kept the books, managed the household accounts, drove the grain truck during harvest, and had opinions she mostly kept to herself unless asked, at which point she delivered them with the economy of someone who had learned that precision mattered more than volume. Their daughter, Nora Hassel, was 22 years old in the fall of 1987. She had graduated that spring from Kansas State University in Manhattan with a degree in agronomy, and she'd come home to the farm the way you come home to a place you love and are slightly afraid of, with your eyes open and your mouth mostly shut and your mind running faster than your feet. Let me tell you about Nora, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from nearly every character this channel has ever told you about, and you need to understand why before you can understand what she was up against. Nora Hassel was not old. She was not experienced. She had not farmed for 30 years and accumulated the kind of quiet authority that comes from surviving 30 Kansas winters on the same piece of ground. What she had was a notebook, a spiral-bound notebook, blue cover, her name written on the front in a black marker, and inside that notebook was 3 years of research she had done under the supervision of a professor named Dr. Raymond Chew at Kansas State, a soil scientist who had spent 15 years studying alternative small grain crops in the Great Plains, and who had told Nora, in her sophomore year, something that had reorganized the way she thought about everything she'd grown up believing. He had told her that winter rye was a better crop for southwestern Kansas than winter wheat, and he had the data to prove it. Now, let me tell you about the science, because the science is the whole argument, and you cannot understand what Nora was proposing without understanding what she knew and why she knew it. Winter rye, cereal rye, Sakale cereal, is not a glamorous crop. It does not have the cultural weight of winter wheat in Kansas. It does not have the infrastructure, the established markets, the generations of institutional knowledge. What it has is biology, and the biology is remarkable. Winter rye is the hardiest of all the small grain cereals. It germinates at soil temperatures as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to winter wheat's threshold of around 40 degrees. It establishes root systems faster and deeper. Rye roots can reach 60 inches into the soil profile in a single growing season, compared to wheat's 40 to 50 inches. That depth matters in a dry year. That depth is the difference between a plant that finds water and a plant that doesn't. But the number that had stopped Nora cold, that had made her sit in Dr. Chew's office for an hour asking questions she wasn't sure were the right questions, was this: winter rye's frost tolerance at the heading stage, the critical flowering period when a late frost can destroy a grain crop in a single night, is approximately 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter wheat's frost tolerance at the same stage is 28 to 30 degrees. That 4 to 6 degree difference sounds small. In western Kansas in late April and early May, when the crop is heading and a cold front can drop temperatures below freezing without much warning. That 4 to 6 degree difference is the margin between a harvest and a catastrophe. Dr. Chew had data from field trials in Nebraska, Colorado, and western Kansas going back to 1971. In years with late frost events below 28 degrees during the heading window, winter wheat yields dropped an average of 62%. Winter rye yields in the same years, on the same soil types, dropped an average of 19%. The rye didn't love the frost, but it survived it. The wheat didn't always. There was more. Rye's input costs were lower. It required less nitrogen fertilizer because it fixed more of its own, and it suppressed weeds aggressively enough to reduce herbicide applications. Its water requirements were 15 to 20% lower than wheat's at equivalent yield levels, and in the markets that existed for rye, distilling, specialty flour milling, rye bread production, the price per bushel in 1987 was running between $3.40 and $3.80, compared to wheat's $2.87. Not a dramatic premium, but a real one, on top of lower costs and better frost resilience. Nora had built a model in her notebook on 100 acres of ground comparable to her family's, assuming average yields and average prices, and one late frost event in every 5 years. Winter rye outperformed winter wheat by $18 to $24 per acre per year over a 10-year horizon. In a frost year, the gap widened to $60 or $70 per acre. On 1,100 acres, that was not a rounding error. That was the difference between a farm that survived and a farm that didn't. She had brought the notebook home in May. She had put it on the kitchen table in June and asked her father to look at it. He had looked at it. He had turned the pages carefully, the way a man handles something he doesn't entirely trust, and then he had closed it and set it down, and looked out the kitchen window at the wheat fields that his grandfather had first planted in 1921, and he had said, "I need to think about it." That had been June. It was now October, and the planting window was opening, and Wendell Hassel had not come back to the conversation. So Nora brought it to him. She found him in the machine shed on a Tuesday afternoon, doing maintenance on the grain drill. She sat down on an overturned bucket and put the notebook on her knee, and she said, "Dad, I need you to give me 100 acres. Just 100. Let me plant rye on the south field and wheat on everything else, and we'll run the numbers side by side for 3 years." Wendell kept working on the drill. He did not look up. He said, "The south field is 140 acres. She said, "Fine, 140 acres. Wheat on the other 960. He put down his wrench. He picked it up again. He said, "Nora, I've been farming this ground for 39 years. Your grandfather farmed it for 31 years before that. We've always planted wheat." She said, "I know. That's not an argument against trying something different. That's just a description of what we've done." He looked at her then. She looked back. There was a long silence in the machine shed, the kind of silence that has weight to it that you can feel pressing on your chest. He said, "Let me talk to your mother." That night, after supper, Marlene Hassel found Nora washing dishes and stood next to her and said quietly, without preamble, "I read your notebook while you were in the barn. She's right, Wendell." And she walked back to the living room, and that was all she said. The next morning, Wendell told Nora she could plant the south field. Now, let me tell you about the man who laughed, because the laugh matters, and I want you to understand exactly what kind of laugh it was. Gene Crowley was 61 years old in the fall of 1987 and had been the manager of the Finney County Farm Bureau Co-op in Garden City for 19 years. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with a gray mustache and the particular confidence of someone who has been right about things in front of other people for long enough that he has stopped distinguishing between the authority he earned and the authority he assumed. He had grown up on a wheat farm. His father had grown up on a wheat farm. He had spent his entire professional life in the service of wheat farmers, and he believed, with the serene certainty of a man who has never been seriously wrong about the thing he knows best, that winter wheat was the correct crop for Finney County, Kansas, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was either ignorant or selling something. He held court most mornings at the co-op counter, where 3 or 4 farmers would stop in for coffee and to talk about prices and weather and equipment, Gene would stand behind the counter with his coffee cup and deliver opinions on whatever the topic was with the unhurried authority of a judge. People listened to him, not because they always agreed with him, but because he had been there a long time and he spoke with conviction, and conviction, in a small county, carries weight. Nora made the mistake of going to the co-op in the second week of October to order her rye seed. She had called ahead to check availability. The co-op carried some rye seed, not much because not many people asked for it, and the woman on the phone had said they had enough for her order and to come in and fill out the paperwork. So Nora drove into Garden City on a Wednesday morning and walked into the co-op and found Gene Crowley behind the counter with two other farmers she recognized, Bud Thornton and Wes Sievert, both wheat farmers, both in their 50s, and she put her order form on the counter and said she needed 140 pounds of certified cereal rye seed. Gene Crowley looked at the order form. He looked at Nora. He looked at the order form again. Then he said, "Rye?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What for?" She said, "To plant." There was a pause. Bud Thornton set down his coffee cup. Wes Sievert turned around from the window where he'd been looking at the parking lot. Gene Crowley said, "You're planting rye instead of wheat." She said, "On 140 acres. Yes." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Gene Crowley started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has just heard something so far outside his category of possibility that his body doesn't know what else to do with it. It was the laugh you give when someone tells you they've decided to sail to work. Not cruelty. Incomprehension. But incomprehension when you're 22 years old and you've just spent 3 years building an argument and you're standing at a counter in your county's co-op trying to order seed feels exactly like cruelty. The distinction doesn't matter much when you're on the receiving end of it. Bud Thornton chuckled. Wes Sievert shook his head slowly and turned back to the window. Gene Crowley said, "Honey, rye is a cover crop. It's a soil amendment. You plant it when you want to fix nitrogen or hold topsoil over winter. You don't plant it as a cash crop in Finney County." Nora said, "Why not?" He said, "Because there's no market for it here. Because the elevators don't handle it. Because nobody around here knows how to grow it. Because your daddy's been farming that ground for 40 years and he's never planted rye, and I'd bet he's not starting now." She said, "He gave me the south field." Another pause. Gene Crowley's smile stayed on his face, but it had gotten smaller. He said, "Well, it's your ground to waste, I suppose." He pulled the order form toward him and started filling in the paperwork. He said, without looking up, "You know what they say about rye and wheat country?" She said, "What do they say?" He said, "They say it's what you plant when you've run out of good ideas." He slid the form back to her. She signed it. She paid for the seed. She drove home. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When Gene Crowley laughed that morning, what was he protecting? He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't stupid. He had 19 years of genuine experience in Finney County agriculture, and he had seen plenty of people try unconventional things and fail, and his laugh came from that experience as much as from his pride. But the laugh also came from somewhere else, from the particular discomfort that arises when someone young and female and recently educated walks into a room and proposes that the thing everyone has always done might not be the best thing to do. The laugh was a door closing. It was faster and easier than engaging with the notebook. It was the sound of a man choosing his certainty over his curiosity, and it would cost him, in the end, more than he could have imagined standing behind that counter on a Wednesday morning in October of 1987. Nora planted the south field the third week of October. She drilled the rye herself, running the grain drill in long straight passes across the 140 acres while her father planted wheat on the rest of the farm. He watched her from the cab of his tractor when their paths crossed along the fence line. He did not say anything. He had made his decision, and he was not a man who second-guessed his decisions out loud. The rye germinated in 11 days. By Thanksgiving, it was 3 inches tall and green and dense across the south field, a darker, coarser green than the wheat emerging on the surrounding fields. Nora walked it every week, noting the stand density, the leaf color, the root development when she pulled sample plants and washed the roots clean. She wrote everything in the notebook. The stand was excellent. The germination rate had been 94%, which was better than the certified seeds labeled rate of 88%. People noticed. This is a small county. You cannot plant 140 acres of something different without people noticing, especially when the something different is visible from the county road and looks noticeably different from the winter wheat in every surrounding field. Farmers driving past slowed down. Some of them stopped and got out and looked. A few of them came down the drive and asked Wendell what was going on with the south field, and Wendell said his daughter was trying something and left it at that. At the co-op that December, Gene Crowley told anyone who asked that Wendell Hassel's girl had planted rye on the south field and that it would be an interesting experiment, but not one he expected to see repeated. He said it with the tolerant amusement of a man watching a child try something he already knows won't work. He said it often enough that by Christmas it had become a kind of running joke in the county. Not vicious, just dismissive, the way small communities dismiss the unfamiliar before they have to decide what to do with it. Nora heard about it. She wrote it in the notebook. Let me tell you about the spring of 1988, because that spring was ordinary, and ordinary is important here. An ordinary spring meant the rye had no dramatic advantage to display. The winter had been cold, but not brutal. The spring was dry, but not catastrophically so. Both the rye and the wheat came out of dormancy in March, looking healthy. The wheat jointed in April. The rye jointed a few days later and grew faster. Rye always grows faster, and by early May it was 6 inches taller than the surrounding wheat and heading toward maturity. The rye harvest came in the last week of June. Nora ran the combine herself on the south field, while her father combined wheat on the rest of the farm. The rye yielded 48 bushels per acre. The wheat on the home farm yielded 41 bushels per acre, which was a good year. The county average for wheat that year was 38 bushels per acre. She sold the rye to a specialty grain buyer in Dodge City who had been sourcing rye for a craft distillery operation in Kansas City. She received $3.55 per bushel. Her input costs on the rye, seed, fertilizer, herbicide, fuel, came to $52 per acre. Her gross revenue was $170.40 per acre. Her net was $118.40 per acre. Her father's wheat, at $2.87 per bushel and 41 bushels per acre, grossed $117.67. His input costs ran $61 per acre. Wheat requires more nitrogen, more herbicide. His net was $56.67 per acre. Nora sat at the kitchen table that July and put the two numbers next to each other. $118.40, $56.67. She did not say anything dramatic. She wrote the numbers in the notebook and she showed them to her father and she said, "1 year's not proof, but it's a start." Wendell looked at the numbers for a long time. He said, "The market for rye is smaller than the market for wheat. You got lucky with the Dodge City buyer." She said, "I know. I've been in contact with 3 other buyers. I have letters." She put the letters on the table next to the notebook. He read them. He set them down. He picked up his coffee cup. He said, "Plant the south field again." She did. She also asked for the east quarter, another 160 acres. And after a long pause, he said yes. In the fall of 1988, Nora planted 300 acres of winter rye and 800 acres of winter wheat. She had established contracts with 2 buyers before the seed went in the ground. She had negotiated a price of $3.60 per bushel with the Dodge City buyer and $3.45 with a flour mill in Wichita that was expanding its specialty grain line. Gene Crowley heard about the expansion. He said at the co-op counter in November that Wendell Hassel was letting his daughter turn the farm into an experiment and that he hoped the old man knew what he was doing. He said it with the same tolerant certainty he always used. His smile was the same size it had always been. But there was something in his voice that hadn't been there the previous year. A slight edge, the sound of a man who has noticed something he doesn't entirely know what to do with. The 1988 rye harvest yielded 44 bushels per acre, slightly lower than the previous year but still strong. The wheat yielded 36 bushels per acre, slightly below the previous year's farm average. The county wheat average that year was 34 bushels per acre. It had been a drier spring. The rye's deeper root system had found moisture the wheat hadn't. Nora's per-acre net on the rye was $106. Her father's per-acre net on the wheat was $48. She showed her father the 2-year numbers. Over 300 acres of rye across 2 seasons. She had netted an average of $112 per acre. The wheat on the same farm, across the same 2 seasons, had netted an average of $52 per acre. The rye was outperforming the wheat by $60 per acre per year. On 300 acres, that was $18,000 per year. That was a tractor payment. That was a year's operating line at the bank. Wendell Hassel looked at the numbers. He set down his coffee cup. He said quietly, with the particular economy of a man who does not spend words he doesn't have to spend, "You decide the rotation this fall." That was October of 1989. Nora was 24 years old. She planted 500 acres of rye and 600 acres of wheat. Now, let me tell you about the spring of 1990, because the spring of 1990 is the reason this story is still being told. The winter of 1989 to 1990 was cold and dry across western Kansas. The wheat and rye both went into dormancy in December looking adequate. Not great, not terrible. The January temperatures were brutal, dropping below 0 for a stretch of 9 days in mid-January, but both crops were well established and cold-hardy and came through without significant winter kill. February was dry, March was dry, April started dry, and then, in the second week, turned wet. A cold, slow, persistent rain system that sat over western Kansas for 11 days and dropped 4 inches of moisture across the county. The rain was welcome. The crops responded. By the last week of April, both the wheat and the rye across Finney County were heading. The critical reproductive stage when the plant sends up its seed head and begins the process of grain fill. This is the most vulnerable moment in a small grain crop's life. The flowers are open. The pollen is moving. The plant is committing every resource it has to producing seed. And this is exactly when a late frost is most dangerous. On the night of May 3, 1990, a cold front moved through southwestern Kansas that nobody had predicted with adequate precision. The forecast had called for temperatures in the low 30s, cold but manageable. What arrived was different. The front moved faster than the models anticipated, and the clear skies behind it allowed radiative cooling that the forecasters had underestimated. By 3 a.m. on May 4th, the temperature at the Garden City weather station was 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Out in the fields, on the flat, open ground away from the town's heat island, it was 22 degrees in some locations. The heading wheat froze. Let me tell you what that means in practical terms, because the number doesn't capture it. When a wheat plant at the heading stage is exposed to temperatures below 28 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 2 or 3 hours, the reproductive tissue inside the seed head, the developing grain, is killed. The plant doesn't die. It keeps growing, keeps looking green, keeps standing in the field. But the grain is gone. The head is empty. You don't know it's happened until you start to see the bleached, twisted, sterile heads emerging in the days after the frost, and by then there's nothing to do. You cannot replant winter wheat in May in Kansas. The season is over. You're looking at a field that will yield nothing, and you're doing the math on what that means for your operating loan and your land payment and your family's winter. Across Finney County, on the morning of May 4th, 1990, farmers walked their wheat fields and found frozen heads. Not everywhere. The damage was uneven, as frost damage always is. Worse in the low spots and the open flats, less severe in the fields with tree windbreaks or slight elevation. But the County Agricultural Extension Office, which sent people out to assess damage in the days following the frost, estimated that 60 to 70% of the county's winter wheat acreage had suffered significant frost damage. Significant meant yield reductions of 40 to 80%. Some fields were a total loss. The phones at the Farm Bureau Co-op rang all day on May 4th. Gene Crowley took calls for 8 hours. He had nothing useful to say. There was nothing useful to say. The frost had come and the wheat was frozen, and the only question now was how bad the harvest would be. Let me tell you about Nora Hassel's south field on the morning of May 4th, 1990. She had been awake since 2 a.m. She had heard the temperature dropping, and she had gone outside in the dark and stood in the field and felt the cold, and she had known. She walked the rye in the dark with a flashlight, bending down to look at the heads, touching the frosted stems, counting. She walked for 2 hours. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and waited for dawn. At first light, she went back out. The rye heads were frosted, coated in ice crystals bent slightly under the weight of the freeze. She pulled heads and split them open with her thumbnail, looking at the florets inside. The florets were intact. The reproductive tissue was alive. The rye had gone to 22 degrees, and it had survived. Her father came out at 6 a.m. He walked the field beside her. Neither of them said anything for a long time. They could see, from the south field, the wheat on the adjacent Thornton farm. Bud Thornton's ground, 400 acres of it, had in wheat that had been in that family for 2 generations. The wheat heads were wrong. Even from a distance you could see it. The way they hung, the slight twist, the color that was not quite right. Bud Thornton was standing at the edge of his field. He was not moving. He was just standing there. Wendell Hassel looked at his neighbor standing in his frozen wheat field. He looked at his daughter's rye, green and alive and heading toward a harvest. He did not say anything, but he put his hand on Nora's shoulder for a moment, and then he walked back to the house. The Hassel farm's wheat, the 600 acres still planted to winter wheat, suffered the same damage as the rest of the county. Nora estimated the wheat yield, when she walked it in the weeks after the frost, at 12 to 15 bushels per acre. At $2.87 a bushel, that was $34 to $43 gross per acre, before input costs of $61 per acre. The wheat was losing money. The rye on the 500 acres came in that June at 46 bushels per acre. At her contracted price of $3.55 per bushel, that was $163.30 gross per acre. After input costs of $52 per acre, her net was $111.30 per acre on 500 acres, in the worst frost year in Finney County's recent memory. The county wheat average that year, accounting for the frost damage, was 14 bushels per acre. The previous 5-year average had been 37. The difference, the 23 bushels per acre that the frost had taken, represented, at $2.87 per bushel, about $66 per acre in lost revenue. Across 280,000 acres of county wheat ground, that was roughly $18.5 million in lost crop value in a single night. Nora Hassel's 500 acres of rye had produced $55,650 in net revenue. Her 600 acres of wheat had produced a net loss of approximately $11,400. The farm's total net, across all 1,100 acres, was still positive, barely because of the rye. Without the rye, the Hassel farm would have posted a significant operating loss in 1990 and gone to the bank for emergency credit, the same as most of their neighbors. She wrote all of it in the notebook. Let me tell you about what happened at the co-op that summer, because it happened slowly and quietly, and it is easy to miss if you're looking for something dramatic. Gene Crowley stopped talking about Nora Hassel's rye experiment, not because he had changed his mind, or not yet, but because the thing he had been dismissing had survived the thing that had destroyed everything around it, and the county knew it, and there was nothing useful to say. The laughter had stopped. In its place was a silence that was, in its own way, louder. Farmers who had driven past the south field the previous 2 winters and shaken their heads were now driving past and slowing down and looking at the rye with a different kind of attention. 3 of them came down the Hassel driveway that July and asked to talk to Nora. She talked to them. She showed them the notebook. She showed them the yield data, the input costs, the revenue comparisons, the frost tolerance research from Dr. Chu's field trials. She showed them the 2-year numbers from her own ground and the 1990 crisis year numbers. She was not triumphant about it. She was not, I want to be clear, the kind of person who said, "I told you so." She was the kind of person who had done the work and had the data and was willing to share it with anyone who asked, because she understood that the point was not to be right. The point was for the county to be better. By August of 1990, 7 farmers in Finney County had contacted her about planting rye that fall. By September, the number was 14. She helped all of them source seed, connect with buyers, plan their rotations. She drove to their farms and walked their ground and told them what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the research said and where the research had gaps. Her father watched this. He watched his daughter sit at the kitchen table with neighboring farmers twice her age, showing them her notebook, answering their questions with the careful precision of someone who has thought hard about the difference between what she knows and what she believes. He watched them listen to her. Really listen, the way you listen to someone who has proven something rather than just claimed something. He watched the county change, slowly, the way counties change. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long series of small decisions made by practical people responding to evidence. In October of 1990, Wendell Hassel, drove to a meeting of the Finney County Farm Bureau. It was a regular fall meeting, the kind held every year to discuss input prices and market outlooks and county business. There were about 60 farmers in the room. Gene Crowley was there, as he always was, sitting at the front. Wendell Hassel stood up during the open discussion period and said that his daughter had something to present if the group was willing to hear it. There was a murmur in the room. Gene Crowley looked at Wendell. He looked at Nora, who was sitting beside her father with her notebook on her lap. His expression was not the expression he had worn at the co-op counter in October of 1987. The certainty was still there, but it had been rearranged slightly, the way a room looks different after someone has moved the furniture. Same pieces, different configuration. He said, "Go ahead." Nora stood up. She was 25 years old. She was wearing a Carhartt jacket and a seed cap, and she had grease on her left hand from working on the combine that morning. She looked like every other farmer in the room. She put her notebook on the table at the front, and she opened it, and she talked for 40 minutes. She talked about root depth and frost tolerance and input costs and market access and the 1990 frost event. She put numbers on the chalkboard at the front of the room. She showed the comparison between her rye acres and her wheat acres across 3 years, and she showed the 1990 crisis year numbers, and she showed Dr. Chu's field trial data from 16 years of research in the Great Plains. She talked about risk, not as an abstraction but as a specific calculation, the probability of a frost event below 28 degrees during the heading window in southwestern Kansas, which the historical weather data put at roughly 1 year in 5. She said that any farm that grew only one crop was a farm that needed only one disaster to fail, and that the 1990 frost had been that disaster for many of their neighbors, and that the question wasn't whether another disaster would come, but when. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when people are thinking rather than waiting. When she finished, there were questions. Good questions. Specific, practical, skeptical, in the productive way that farmers are skeptical, which is to say they were looking for the flaw in the argument rather than the reason to dismiss it. She answered every question. When she didn't know the answer, she said so and told them where to find it. Gene Crowley did not ask a question during the meeting. He sat at the front of the room and listened. After the meeting ended and people were filing out, he stayed in his chair. Nora was gathering her papers. Her father was talking to a neighbor near the door. Gene Crowley said, "Nora." She looked up. He said, "I need you to come by the co-op. I want to talk about what we can carry for next fall's planting season." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I remember what you told me about rye and wheat country, Gene, what they say about it." He held her gaze. He said, "I remember it too." She said, "I'll come by Thursday." He nodded. She closed her notebook and walked to where her father was waiting. Let me tell you about what happened in the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in 1990, and you need to know that. By the fall of 1991, 22 farmers in Finney County had planted winter rye on a portion of their acreage. Not as a replacement for wheat. Nora had never argued for that, and she was careful to say so, but as a component of a diversified rotation. The county's rye acreage went from 140 acres in 1987 to approximately 4,800 acres in 1991. The Dodge City specialty grain buyer expanded his operation. A second buyer, a malt house in Wichita, entered the market. The infrastructure that Gene Crowley had said didn't exist began, slowly, to be built. Gene Crowley stocked rye seed at the co-op starting in the fall of 1991. He did not make an announcement about it. He just stocked it. Nora Hassel was invited to speak at the Kansas State Agronomy Extension Conference in Manhattan in the spring of 1992. She was 27 years old. She presented a paper co-authored with Dr. Chu on winter rye performance in southwestern Kansas, drawing on her own farm data and the data from the 22 Finney County farms that had planted rye in 1990 and 1991. The paper was published in the Extension Service's Research Bulletin. Dr. Chu told her it was the most practically useful piece of research he had seen in 15 years of extension work. Her father drove to Manhattan for the conference. He sat in the back of the room. When she finished her presentation, he stood up. He was the only person in the room who stood. He sat down quickly, embarrassed, and looked at the floor, and Nora looked at him from the front of the room and did not say anything, and did not have to. The Hassel farm, by 1993, was running 600 acres of rye and 500 acres of wheat in a rotation that Nora designed and managed. The farm's net revenue per acre, averaged across all 1,100 acres, was $94. The county average for wheat-only operations that year was $51 per acre. The difference, on 1,100 acres, was $47,300 per year. Across the 6 years since Nora had planted the first 140 acres, the Hassel farm had outperformed the county average by a cumulative total that Wendell calculated one evening in his machine shed and then put back in the ledger book without saying anything to anyone, because he was not a man who needed to say it out loud to know what it meant. In the spring of 1993, Nora's younger brother, Daniel, who was 20 years old and had been farming alongside her for 2 years since finishing high school, came to the kitchen table one evening with a folder of papers. He said he had been reading about cover crop mixes, winter rye combined with hairy vetch and crimson clover, and what they did to soil organic matter and nitrogen availability over a 5-year rotation. He said he thought they should try it on 80 acres. Nora looked at the papers. She read them. She asked him 3 questions. He answered them. She said, "Yes, let's plant it this fall." He looked at her. He said, "You're not going to make me wait?" She said, "I read the research. It's sound. You've thought it through. Why would I make you wait?" He said, "Because that's what people do. They make you wait." She said, "I know." She put the folder back on the table. She said, "We're not going to do that. Let me tell you one last thing, because this is the part of the story that matters most, and it is easy to miss if you're looking at the yields and the revenue figures and the frost tolerance data." Nora Hassel planted winter rye on 140 acres in Finney County, Kansas, in the fall of 1987. She was 22 years old, and she had a notebook and a 3-year research project and a professor who believed in the data, and a mother who read the notebook at the kitchen table and told her father she was right. She had no authority. She had no standing. She had no history of harvests behind her name the way the men at the co-op counter had history behind theirs. She had the numbers, and she had the patience to wait for the ground to confirm them, and she had the particular stubbornness of a person who has done the work and knows what the work shows and is not willing to pretend otherwise because the room is laughing. The room laughed in October of 1987. The frost came in May of 1990. The wheat died. The rye lived. That is not a metaphor. That is a yield report. But it is also a metaphor. Nora Hassel still farms the 1,100 acres in Finney County. She rotates rye and wheat in a cover crop mix that Daniel designed, and she improved over 3 subsequent years. She keeps her records in a laptop now, but the original blue spiral notebook is on the shelf in the machine shed office, next to 39 years of her father's green ledger books. Wendell Hassel retired from active farming in 1998 and died in 2011. At his funeral, 6 farmers from the county spoke about him. 3 of them mentioned the South Field. The county's rye acreage, as of the last agricultural census, is approximately 31,000 acres. The infrastructure Gene Crowley said didn't exist. The buyers, the storage, the market access exist now. Gene Crowley retired from the co-op in 2001. He and Nora had a working relationship for the last 10 years of his tenure that was, by all accounts, productive and professional and occasionally warm. He never said he had been wrong in October of 1987. He didn't have to. The county said it for him, one planted field at a time. Sometimes the youngest person in the room is the one who has read the research nobody else bothered to read. Sometimes the data is sitting in a blue notebook on a kitchen table, waiting for someone to look at it. Sometimes it takes a frost at 22 degrees to show a county what it already had the information to know. Nora planted rye in a wheat county. They laughed. The frost came, the wheat died, the rye lived, and the farm that was supposed to be an experiment is still running, 37 years later, on the same 1,100 acres, with the same notebook on the shelf and the same flat Kansas horizon out the machine shed door. And the only thing that has changed is everything.